Our wheel's journey is rolling into its final stop today, or rather, stops. We'll be visiting two places this week, moving our timeline just a little bit closer to the present. Our first stop will be in Old Saybrook, where Maryam Elahi will share with us the history of the James Pharmacy and its connection to the Harlem Renaissance. Following that visit, we'll come back across the river, and I'll meet you on the grounds of the Flo Grizz, the place that we started this entire journey. And I'll share with you why and how the stories that we've been exploring aren't simply about the past, but have to do with our present. After that, we'll come back here, and I'll lay out something of what this journey might come to mean for us as a faith community. As we make these final stops, I want you to have the parable of the sower in mind, where Jesus tells a story about a farmer scattering seeds across the ground. Some of that seed fell on rocky soil. Some of it fell among thorns. Some of it fell in barren soil, all of it yielding little. But some of it fell on fertile ground, producing an abundance of growth. Seeds are scattered within each of us, and it's clear for many people that thorns and rocks and barren places within their souls tend to crowd out the potential for goodness. That potential is always there, but it can be crowded out. And I think we've seen that over and over again on our journey through the deep north. Some thorny, rocky, barren places within the human heart led some to create a hell on earth for indigenous peoples and for those descended from Africa. But you see, some seed falls on good soil, and it grows and flowers and flourishes in surprising ways. That was true of Venture Smith and his family. It was true, so far as we can tell, of Quash Gomer and William Winters. It was true of Prudence Crandall, and whatever we might think of John Brown, I would argue that it was true for him as well. The seed sown in hearts such as theirs blossomed, and it yielded good fruit. Perhaps we too are nurturing seeds within our hearts. Perhaps these stories from the deep north are such seeds given to us to tend and to grow in our lives. As we make these visits in the coming moments, I simply invite you to consider the seeds that might be worth nurturing and tending in your heart and in our world today. I invite you to ask, in a world torn apart by conflict based around this hidden and sometimes not so hidden wound of enslavement, of ethnic cleansing, of racism, what is it now that needs tending? What is it that needs growth and care here and now in this place called the Deep North? Let's head on over to Old Saybrook.
Good morning. We're standing here in front of the James Pharmacy, a site in Old Saybrook that will be familiar to many of you. Whereas many of the stories we've told during the Wheels of Justice series have been difficult, this site is cause for celebration. The James Pharmacy is named after Ms. Anna James, a remarkable person who ran the pharmacy for more than 50 years, from 1911 to 1967. She was a beloved figure in Old Saybrook. At her 80th birthday party in 1966, some 250 people showed up to wish her well. In 1974, after she had retired from the pharmacy, the local VFW honored her as the Person of the Year for her long practice of compassion and care, dispensing remedies to various ailments. But she had a story like few others, and it's one we need to know. And we're here to celebrate her and her cousin, and hopefully someday we'd like to have a plaque right here so that anyone who walks through our town will know of the valuable people who worked here in this pharmacy. Miss James's father escaped slavery. He fled a plantation in Virginia when he was 16. Traveling through the Underground Railroad, he eventually settled in Hartford, Connecticut. That's where he met Anna Houston. Together, they raised a family of 11 children. They moved to Old Saybrook in 1985. Ms. James joined them permanently in 1902 when she moved here in order to attend Old Saybrook High School. But listen to what happens next. After high school, Ms. James fought both segregation and sexism and managed to enroll not only as the first woman, but as the first African-American woman at the Brooklyn College of Pharmacy, from which she graduated in 1908. In 1909, she became the first African-American woman to be granted a pharmacy license in the state of Connecticut. Later in 1920, she became one of the first women who enrolled to vote in the state of Connecticut. And those of you who voted here in Old Saybrook might have gotten a little sticker, which I have saved, with her photo on it. It turns out that there were a number of pharmacists in the family. Ms. James's brother, Fritz, operated the pharmacy in Old Lyme, and her brother-in-law, Peter Lane, opened the pharmacy that we're standing in front of right now, all the way back to 1895. Old Saybrook is still predominantly white, but it was even more so then. To open a business as an African American would have been incredibly challenging, but the family managed to do so. Ms. James had worked here during high school, and upon graduating from the pharmacy school, she returned, eventually taking over the pharmacy full-time. She worked here, but she also lived upstairs until the time of her death in 1977. As you might see, there's an apartment upstairs here at the pharmacy. But that's not the end of the story, as remarkable as it is, because another very important person grew up right here in this pharmacy, working its counter during high school, much like Ms. James. And that person was Anne Petrie, who was the niece of Anna James. Born here in Old Saybrook in 1908, Anne Petrie went on to become an acclaimed writer, publishing one of the landmark novels of the Harlem Renaissance, a novel called The Street. The novel has to do with the struggles of a young mother trying to raise a child at that time in this country. The Street was published in 1946, and it became the first book by an African American to sell over 1 million copies. It brought Anne Petrie instant fame, which she spent the rest of her life trying to avoid. Like Anna James, Anne Petrie was initially on track to join the family business. She too went to pharmacy school and briefly returned to work here at James's pharmacy. But in 1938, she married and moved to New York City, where she studied creative writing at Columbia University. It was that experience that gave her insight into the conditions many people struggling to survive in Harlem in those years. After The Street was published and sold, Anne Petrie decided to return to Old Saybrook. A recent article quotes Ms. Petrie as saying that while she did receive encouragement for her skills as a young person, she also suffered the indignities of white bigotry in town. Boys throwing stones at her as she walked to school, a white beachgoer objecting to her presence on the town beach, a teacher who refused to provide her instruction. Shameful. Nevertheless, she chose to return to Old Saybrook after her success. She chose to build a life here, in this place, despite those indignities. Today, the names and lives of the boys who threw the stones are long gone. The names of the teacher or the white beachgoer, these are people who history has forgotten. Anne Petrie's name, on the other hand, is now the occasion for public recognition and celebration. Anne Petrie and Anna James are two remarkable women associated with this site, the James Pharmacy. Their stories, together with that of their extended family, is a lesson for those of us now living in places like Old Saybrook and Old Lyme. Our communities were made what they are by the contributions of so many Native and African Americans. And our communities have been immeasurably enriched by the presence of those like Anna James and Anne Petrie. We are who we are in no small part because of courageous women like them. And as a resident of Old Saybrook, I am so proud to stand in their shadow. It is time to learn those histories and to give them the public acclaim they so richly deserve.
For this, our last stop on our stories through the Deep North, our journey through the Deep North, I wanted to come back to the place that we began. At the beginning of this journey, Carolyn Wakeman shared a story that occurred here in Old Lyme about a child named Jane. We know that she was sold away from her mother when she was 3 years old. She would have lived on Upper Lyme Street, right in this area here, approximately where the Bee and Thistle and the Flo Gris Museum are now situated. We don't know much beyond that, except that the record of her sale states that she was given, quote, to have and to hold, possess and enjoy. We can imagine the bewilderment of that child taken away from her family. And we can imagine the anguish of her mother, who would later be separated from her other children. The selling of a 3-year-old child named Jane. This happened here in Old Lyme. But we've learned so much else that happened here as well along our journey through the Deep North. The Dewolfe family, some of whom went on to operate one of the largest slaving operations in the Northeast, even perhaps in the United States, got their start here in Old Lyme. A child named Jack was born and grew up in the home that I reside in. This town prospered through trade with the West Indies, which was wholly dependent upon slavery. Some 160 named individuals lived in our town as enslaved people, and those are merely the ones who appear in property records. As we walk down Lyme Street and gaze at the beauty of the historic homes and buildings, we can be certain that many were built, at least in part, by the labor of enslaved people. But then, there is the knowledge that the pews of our meeting house were once segregated. There is the truth that a free woman of color was once excommunicated from our church. There's the fact that an ardent segregationist, who would later become the President of the United States, dedicated our meeting house upon its completion in 1910. These are things that happened here. I'm haunted by those stories. I think about them now as I drive or walk down Lyme Street. I think about them as I do dishes in the home that I reside in. I think about them as I enter our meeting house. I feel the weight of those stories, but I also feel responsible before them. Responsible for telling the stories, responsible for remembering them, responsible for learning from them, and for growing as a result of them. We've started to do those things as a result of our journey through the Deep North, but it needs to continue. To that end, I'm so pleased to say that our school system here in Lyme and Old Lyme has committed to teaching those stories in its curriculum. Students will come to know the stories of children like Jane and Jack Howard, raised in this very town, but in circumstances that most residents of our town now can scarcely imagine. They'll come to know other stories and names as well, like Temperance, like Oxford, like Nancy, and like Louis Louia. I want my children to know those names, to say those names, and to reckon with the burdens of living in the Deep North. And I'm grateful that our schools here in town have been receptive to that need as well. But it's also true that each of our towns here in the Deep North has its own particular stories to tell. Old Saybrook, Essex, Deep River, Madison, Clinton, Westbrook, Niantic, all of them have stories to tell. If you live in one of those places, why not search those stories out? They exist in town archives. And why not urge your own school board to commit to telling the stories of the Deep North? But other challenges remain. Few people of color reside in Old Lyme or anywhere along the Connecticut shoreline today, in large part because of our history of exclusion. In the town archives of Old Lyme, land records exist from the early to mid-20th century, where the sale of certain parcels of land to people of color was explicitly forbidden. We rightly abhor such practices, but we must do more than simply abhor them. We must actively seek to correct them. Sadly, it was only 3 years ago that 37 units of affordable housing were proposed here in Old Lyme, housing that would have helped to open the town to a greater array of economic and racial diversity. A vocal segment of the community made it clear that such a project was not welcome here. They chose to hold it up in court until the proposal was finally withdrawn. That episode remains an open wound, for it extended the history of racial and economic exclusion that has been a part of this community for far too long. It is, I suggest, a wound that can only be healed by inviting Hope Partnership, the agency that proposed that affordable housing project, to return to Old Lyme and to finally build here. I remain hopeful that that may yet occur. So too, in the fall of last year, a number of individuals brought before the Board of Selectmen a resolution concerning racism as a public health crisis. It stated that inequities in housing, education, wages, healthcare, and law enforcement have a disproportionate effect on people of color. And it urged communities like this one to begin to do the work of addressing those disparities. While some 30 towns and cities have adopted and embraced that resolution, Old Lyme has thus far elected not to. Given the burden of our history, I believe we owe it both to those who came before us and to those living all around us to adopt that resolution. It signifies our sense of responsibility to do what we can to write a future that is different from our past. We'll have a copy of that resolution posted on our website, and if you're willing, it would be helpful to write a letter to our selectmen urging them to adopt it. If you live in another town, you can urge your selectmen to adopt it there. Old Saybrook has done so, but most of our shoreline towns have thus far chosen not to. Now is the time to urge them to do so. But more than anything, I want us to keep thinking about Jane, to keep thinking about Jack, to keep thinking about all of those like them who lived here in Old Lyme. Though it comes much, much too late. I wish to know how we might still draw them close, how we might yet protect them and love them. I wish to allow the tears of the heartbroken mother who lost her child to the slave trade here in Old Lyme. I wish to allow her tears to wash over us, a baptism from which we might yet be reborn. What would it mean to undergo such a baptism here, now? What would it mean to draw Jane and Jack close now, in 2021? What will it mean in Old Lyme and all across the deep north to let their voices at last be heard?